Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This one is going to be very different from anything that I've ever done. The recording that I'm about to share was not intended to be on a podcast episode. In fact, the transcript of it was being used for my book editor. We were just expanding some of the stories in a book that I'm writing, a business book that I'm writing. And he asked me for the whole story, the whole element of one of my kind of origin stories about where my entrepreneurial journey started. And he asked me for quite a bit of detail. And I wasn't planning on sharing this because a lot of personal stuff and it's a very vulnerable story. And I've shared components of this, I've shared parts of this on podcasts before, but this was like everything and actually got me thinking through elements that I had completely forgotten about. But I'm going to share it because I think that it helps somebody who's been in this spot who maybe thinks they're alone, or maybe it hits someone who's going through this, or someone that's going through this, and you can share this story with them. I think it's important. I think the human elements, I think the challenges that we face when we're winning on paper but losing in our soul. So I'm going to share it. I'd love to know if it resonates or if you have any thoughts or similar experiences. I'd love for you to write me, mike@mikemall.co. Yeah. So with that, here's the story of my mild mental breakdown and me quitting my job. Okay, I'm going to walk through the story of the day that I quit that job. So I was living in Toronto on Yonge Street in a really posh building, really posh neighborhood. Not that I was making a ton of money, but when I was in the insurance world, I ascended at corporate level. I came in as a 21-year-old with no experience and no degree, and I worked in a pretty basic level job starting at that point. But what I realized very early in that world, that job, is that like most people that are there, the most skilled, talented people, they're there because they have a family, they're there because they need the consistency, but they're not of that killer mindset. And so I use that to my advantage, which is the thing I think that helped me in my entrepreneurial journey, where it's okay, how do we optimize? How do we things quickly? How do we simplify things as much as possible? So I just was naturally doing that because I saw so much inefficiency. These rules about filling out a form to fill out another form was a wild concept to me. And I found myself questioning a lot of things while working in that company that like they just didn't have an answer for. And because it was such a huge company, the company was Aviva. I think they had over 3,000 employees just in Canada alone, but worldwide it's a much bigger company. And so I quickly ascended and created some enemies along the way because I was that like try hard guy. But the truth is I could get my work done before 11 a.m. most days. I spent my time messing around online mostly once my work ran out, but then I started to lean in and push up the ladder a bit. So I was in my first role for a few years, and then I jumped up into a role managing a property. So if property had been damaged or broken into or had a fire, etc., I would be the guy that helped assess those things, but normally on the commercial side. And that was an okay job. Dealt with a lot of break-ins. I think every role mostly was complete. I kept pushing and pushing with these roles. So I just put in, I wouldn't even say it was maximum effort. I created a lot of efficiencies in what I did, and I was always a top performer within my role. And one thing that drove me crazy about that company is there was no advantage to being the top performer. They just gave you more work. And I remember when we were doing performance reviews, I actually stopped giving them my performance review. So every year you're supposed to submit where you think you're at and how you think you performed. And then meet with your manager and you'd compare notes and they would give you a rating that determined your bonus. And I actually stopped doing them. A lot of people on my team thought I was crazy because I was defying the company policy that I was going to get in trouble. But I didn't want to do it because, number one, it wasn't my job to tell you how I was doing. I was going to skew that data because we always look at ourselves as doing less than how other people perceive us, number one. And number two is that because I was moving through things so fast, they were giving me the more complicated files, but they weren't adjusting my goals. So my KPIs were around like, okay, if we get one new claim that's open, you need to close one. But I was getting the really elaborate cases or really complicated stuff or things that had a lot of parties involved or were under investigation for something. And so they expected me to close one for every new file that I got. And they had the same rule and boundary as the person who's getting really basic petty theft claims or like really small fire damage claims, right? And so I stopped doing the performance reviews. And I said to them, like, you can't give me the most complicated stuff and then hold me to the same standards as everybody else. That was a bit of a defiance. That entrepreneurial spirit coming out of me where like I saw things that were not done well. And I just thought, I hate everything about this. So what are we doing? Why can't there be any flexibility to accommodate for real differences, real variations in the work? And anyway, so I ended up getting bumped up again. And so I was in a role in my fifth year in. I was in a role that really people got closer to their 10th year in. So I had advanced very quickly. My salary was significantly higher than people with my amount of time in the company. I had negotiated a home office, a company car, a decent salary, like a high five-figure salary, 4 weeks vacation. These were all things that people my age and my level of experience at the company did not get. I forced my way into them. And so I was at the peak of where I could be relative to my age and my experience. And so on paper, I had it all, right? 4 weeks vacation, really good benefits package, good money, company car. Like I was living in quote unquote, the dream life with that. So I'm living in this apartment in this posh neighborhood, Toronto on Yonge Street, which is a sought after area. I'm married, not going well. I'm working in this risk assessment job and I was going to the office a couple days a week just to get out. I wasn't really doing that much work at home. And to be honest, the role was so depressing because you were talking to people who were lying about how injured they were, and then talking to your own clients who was lying about how responsible or how liable they were for the situations. One interesting thing about that, though, is that your bullshit detector gets very strong very fast. I'd be in the middle of interviews, like knowing that they're going down a path of lying and just saying, I would pause the interview, a formal way that we used to pause the interviews because we had to, in case our recordings had to go to court. And I would stop them and I would say, hey, look, we can keep going down this path. Or if you think that your story maybe has gone off the track a little bit, we could start over again. And sometimes they would keep going. But when I told them that these recordings were potentially going to be admissible in court, a lot of people stopped and went back and started over again and had a little bit more of a modest version of their story. But I was just so pressed at my relationship that we both knew that we shouldn't be in. We got married. Here's the next step. Here's the next step. When you're over experience your life, moving through the steps that are check marks on paper, do this, then do this, that like storybook, that sitcom, that TV show version of how you're supposed to do everything. And I was following it and I was not listening to myself at all because I enjoyed the security and I enjoyed the status. The way I was getting it was not serving my soul. Anyway, the day that it happened was just like any other day, really struck caffeinating as much as possible, just trying to find any semblance of motivation to go and complete something. And at that point in the job, I was doing very little. Like I was avoiding work play. Stuff was getting, but in my opinion, I was like, I'd basically taken my foot off the gas, like very little effort, doing all the things that absolutely need to be done, getting things on deadline, like at the last moment. I had nothing left in the tank. I could not fake my way through it. And I just didn't want to talk to any of the people that I was talking to, or be it my coworkers, this like sitting in this office, cookie cutter bullshit, water fountain talk stuff. Nobody has a fucking life. Nobody does anything interesting with their time. And then the clients worse than that. And I don't know, I just got in the car and I drove to the office. I was sitting in the parking lot and I remember taking like a slight moment to just sit and breathe, which is not something that I typically do. I was doing everything in fast forward mode, just bulldozing my way through it, trying to, I guess, forget that I didn't like anything that was going on in my life. And I figured if I kept moving as fast as I was moving, then it couldn't catch me. I remember that morning I took just the slightest moment to take a breath. And I wasn't into any mindfulness or meditation, anything at that time. It hadn't even ever crossed my mind. So it wasn't like a thing that was a planned thing or something part of a routine of mine. It was just in that moment. I felt like I'm just going to take a second here. I don't know why it happened. But when that happened, I just got hit with this flood of emotion. And I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I remember this surge of like blood to my head, almost like ears ringing, almost like this dizziness coming on. And I remember thinking, oh, this is what happens. And I had a coworker that passed away, actually. He was morbidly obese, did nothing to improve his health. And so he had a heart attack because of that reason. I felt this thing coming on. It turned out to be a panic attack. At the time, I thought, oh, I'm going to end up rolling around convulsing. This is it for me. And it was just such an overwhelming and fast thing where I started shaking. My breathing was off. I was getting like my head flooded with blood and energy, and I couldn't focus my eyes. And I thought I was going to collapse. At that moment, I just broke down in tears. And at first, it was silence, and it was just like uncontrollable streaming down my face. And then it was like, it went to the point of hysterical. Like I was just, I guess it was so much buildup with no way to get out, with no way to express itself, with no way to release for so long. It felt like an eternity, but it had to have been 10 to 15 minutes where I just couldn't do anything. I was just crying. I was shaking. I couldn't even use my arms to open the door. I couldn't open the windows. I was there and I was lost. I was lost in my brain. I was lost in my sadness and anger. And then after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, I remember calling my dad first. We were very close. He wasn't a great father, but he had worked in the industry and maybe he had experienced this before I didn't know. So I called him and expressed what I could express about it. I can't do this. I don't like this role. I don't like this job. I'm not in the right position. I'm not in the right life. And then I ended up calling my mom. I ended up calling my wife, and I had the same conversation with the three of them. And obviously, their feedback and their way that they expressed themselves were different, but the message was the same. The message was people like us, we don't get to just quit. We don't get to just make that decision. We need to stick it out. We need to find another job. Once we find that job and we have that security, that's when we pull the plug. That's when we can quit. I knew they were right. On paper, I didn't have a lot of money put away. I wasn't great with money at the time and I wasn't making crazy money at the time, but I knew that they were right on paper, but I knew it was the wrong answer for me. And so in that moment, my brain clicked and just said, okay, I'm not coming here. I will not set foot in this space. I will not work this job another day. And I got out of the car. My face was probably just red from the crying. And I walked in, went straight into my boss's office, asked if he had a minute. I didn't even have a resignation letter. I just quit on the spot. He was very mad. He screamed at me at the moment. He was going through something and they were having some staffing and some issues with his new boss. And so I don't think it was anything about me. I don't think it was anything special that they couldn't lose or anything like that. But I remember he screamed at me when I quit. I just said, okay. I walked away. I went back to my desk. I typed up my resignation letter. I was going to do the right thing. I was going to clean some stuff up, make some notes for them on where I was leaving everything and where the files were at. And I never feel like, even with that level of bridge burning, that you should ever really burn it like a middle fingers up, unless they had done something to horribly wrong you, which in this case they hadn't. This was me being in the wrong place. It had nothing to do with them. So my intention was to leave with, give them some direction on how to take over my stuff. He did come to my desk later and apologize, but it didn't change my mind. And he asked to speak with me, and that conversation changed. I was so locked in. I was so quit. And that decision was so concrete. And from that moment, that's when I, number one, realized, okay, you better figure something out. If you're going to be this fancy entrepreneur guy, you better start something fast because you don't, your runway here, not too long. My wife was making six figures at the time, but it was not her intention to feed our family. Like she had me working very soon after, even though it was like a sales role. I'll save that story for time. I knew that my runway wasn't good, and I knew that people were going to react poorly, including her, obviously, because cutting off one of our incomes was that abruptly was probably a bit of a shock to the system, but it was the right choice. I was breathing so much easier, and even though people were either disappointed or mad or had their opinions, I was so at peace. I was so at peace with that job. I felt so good.